August 29th, 1526. The sun climbed over the Hungarian plains near the village of Mohacs, casting long shadows across a waterlogged field that would soon become a graveyard for an entire kingdom. On one side of this marshy expanse stood the flower of Hungarian nobility, armoured knights who represented the last great hope of Central Europe against Ottoman expansion. On the other side, partially concealed behind a screen of a light cavalry and carefully positioned artillery, waited 15,000 men who would rewrite the rules of warfare. They were called Janissaries, new soldiers. And on this sweltering summer afternoon, they would demonstrate that the age of the armoured knight was over. This is the story of how Ottoman infantry armed with matchlock muskets destroyed the strongest cavalry force in Eastern Europe in less than 2 hours, killing a king and ending Hungarian independence for generations. It's the story of the day when gunpowder proved definitively superior to steel armour and charging warhorses. The Battle of Mohacs wasn't just a military defeat, it was a paradigm shift that echoed across Europe for centuries. To understand how such a catastrophe occurred, we need to understand who these Janissaries were, and why European commanders consistently underestimated them until it was far too late. The Janissary Corps was founded in the late 14th century during the reign of Sultan Murad I, or possibly his father Orhan. Unlike European armies of the time, which relied on feudal levies and seasonal campaigns, the Janissaries were something unprecedented. A permanent standing army composed of professional soldiers who trained year-round. They were perhaps the first modern standing army since the fall of the Roman Empire. Their origin was as dark as it was effective. The system was called Dev Shirme, the child levy. Every few years, Ottoman officials would travel through Christian villages in the Balkans, selecting boys between the ages of 8 and 20. These boys were taken from their families, forcibly converted to Islam, and enrolled in a rigorous training program that lasted over a decade. For these children, their former lives were systematically erased. They were taught that the Sultan was their father, that the Janissary Corps was their family, that loyalty to the Ottoman state was their only purpose. They learned Turkish, studied Islam, and absorbed military discipline unlike anything Europe could produce. By the time they graduated to full Janissary status, they had known nothing but military life for years. They were forbidden to marry, forbidden to engage in trade, forbidden to grow beards in their early service. They lived in barracks, ate communal meals from enormous cooking pots that became symbols of their units, and marched to the haunting rhythm of the military bands. These were not conscripts fulfilling temporary obligations, they were monks of warfare. But what made the Janissaries truly revolutionary was their early adoption of firearms. As early as the 1440s, during the reign of Sultan Murad II, Janissaries began training with arquebuses, primitive matchlock firearms that European armies would not widely adopt for another half-century. By the time of the Siege of Constantinople in 1453, Janissaries were not only skilled archers, but also experienced gunners who could operate both small arms and artillery. When Sultan Mehmed II breached the Theodosian walls and conquered the Byzantine capital, Janissaries armed with early firearms led the final assault through the shattered fortifications. European observers were shocked. How had infantry armed with noisy, slow-loading weapons defeated the strongest walls in Christendom? The answer lay not in the weapons themselves, but in how the Janissaries used them. They understood something that European armies were only beginning to grasp. Concentrated firepower delivered by disciplined formations could shatter even the most determined assault. By the early 16th century, Janissaries were being systematically equipped with matchlock muskets. These weapons, called tüfek in Turkish, varied in size and caliber. The standard battlefield musket was typically between 115 and 140 centimetres long, weighed 3 to 4.5 kilograms, and fired lead balls of 13 to 14 millimetre caliber. These were roughly equivalent to the muskets used by their European opponents. But the Janissaries also employed heavier weapons, including massive trench guns that fired 80mm balls and were feared by every army that faced them. What set Janissary firearms apart was not their individual superiority but the training behind them. While European arquebusiers often learned their trade in weeks or months, Janissaries drilled with their weapons for years. They could fire with precision unmatched by European soldiers. They understood how to maintain their weapons in the field. Most importantly, they had developed tactical formations that maximised the effectiveness of massed musket fire. The volley fire technique that would later revolutionise European warfare was employed by Janissaries at Mohács in 1526. This was among the first documented uses of coordinated volley fire in battle. The Janissaries would form in multiple rows, typically 8 or 9 ranks deep. The front rank would kneel and fire. As they reloaded, the second rank would step forward and fire, then the third. By the time the 8th or 9th rank had fired, the first rank had reloaded and was ready to deliver another volley. The result was a nearly continuous stream of fire that could devastate charging cavalry. European observers described it as a wall of lead. When this tactic was combined with artillery positioned just behind the Janissary lines, it created a killing zone that even the heaviest cavalry could not penetrate. The psychological effect was as important as the physical damage. The thunder of massed musket fire, the clouds of smoke, the sight of men and horses falling before they could close to melee range, all of this shattered the morale of cavalry who had been trained to believe that their charge was irresistible. Now let's turn to the other side of the battlefield. The Hungarian army that marched to Mohács in August 1526 represented the last gasp of medieval Hungarian military power. At the centre of this force were the armoured knights of the Bandarium, heavy cavalry equipped like their Western European counterparts, but with a distinctive Hungarian flair. These men were the military elite of the kingdom, nobles and their retinues, equipped at enormous personal expense with the finest armour and weapons money could buy. The core of Hungarian heavy cavalry wore 3/4 or full plate armour. Steel plates covered their torsos, arms and legs. Helmets protected their heads. Some wore additional mail beneath their plate for extra protection. Their horses were similarly protected in many cases, with chanfron covering their faces and plate barding protecting their chests and flanks. These were war horses bred for size and strength, larger and more powerful than the typical mounts of the Ottoman Sipahi cavalry. A fully armoured Hungarian knight on a barded warhorse could weigh over 300 kilograms combined. Their primary weapon was the lance, some measuring up to 4 meters long. These lances were designed for the single most important moment in medieval warfare, the charge. When hundreds of armoured knights charged in formation, lances lowered, the impact could shatter infantry formations and break enemy cavalry. The psychological effect was immense. The ground shook. The thunder of hooves was deafening. The sight of these armoured juggernauts bearing down inspired terror in their enemies. For centuries, this tactic had dominated European battlefields. After the initial lance charge, knights would transition to their secondary weapons. Swords, typically straight-bladed one-handed weapons evolved from the medieval arming sword. Maces and warhammers for crushing armour, some carried axes. In close combat, the weight and protection of their armour gave them overwhelming advantages against lighter cavalry or unarmoured infantry. But by 1526, the Hungarian heavy cavalry was facing challenges that armour and courage could not overcome. The kingdom had been in decline since the death of King Matthias Corvinus in 1490. Matthias had maintained the Black Army, one of Europe's first professional standing armies, composed of well-paid mercenaries who trained year-round. But his successors had allowed this force to dissolve. By 1526, Hungary's military had reverted to the old feudal system. Nobles brought their retinues when summoned by the king. These retinues were often poorly trained, and many nobles resented having to serve at all. Making matters worse, in 1514, Hungary had been torn apart by a massive peasant rebellion, led by György Dózsa. The rebellion was crushed with horrific brutality, but it left deep scars. The peasantry, which should have formed the backbone of light infantry, was now deeply hostile to the nobility. When King Louis II summoned his army in 1526, many peasants simply refused to come. Others came reluctantly and were unreliable in battle. The Hungarian cavalry at Mohács was also divided in quality. The professional mercenary cavalry, often German or Bohemian, were experienced and well-equipped. But many of the noble banners were undertrained and poorly prepared for the kind of warfare they were about to face. Some nobles brought inadequate numbers of troops. Others brought men who had barely trained together. There was also a critical strategic division. János Sápolyai, the powerful voivode of Transylvania, commanded approximately 13,000 troops. But these forces were guarding mountain passes to the south and could not reach Mohács in time. Count Cristo Frankopan commanded 5,000 Croatian troops, but they too were too distant to arrive before the battle. King Louis II, just 20 years old and inexperienced in command, was left with only about 25,000 to 30,000 troops to face a vastly larger Ottoman army. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had left Constantinople on April 23, 1526, with an army that contemporary sources estimated at 100,000 men, though modern historians suggest the true fighting force was closer to 50,000 to 60,000 by the time they reached Mohacs. Even at the conservative estimate, the Ottomans outnumbered the Hungarians roughly 2 to 1. The Ottoman army was a sophisticated combined arms force. There were approximately 45,000 cavalry, including both the Timariyat Sipahi provincial cavalry and the elite royal cavalry. There were 15,000 infantry, of which 10,000 to 15,000 were Janissaries armed with muskets. The Ottomans also brought approximately 200 to 300 artillery pieces, ranging from massive siege cannons to lighter field guns. Against this, the Hungarians fielded about 15,000 cavalry, 15,000 infantry, and only 50 to 80 light cannons. The disparity in artillery was particularly ominous. Ottoman artillery had been devastating European fortifications for decades. At Mohacs, these guns would be turned against cavalry in the open field. The Hungarian leadership faced an impossible choice. They could wait for reinforcements from Transylvania and Croatia, but this would give Suleiman time to advance on the capital at Buda unopposed. Or they could fight immediately with the forces they had and hope that the legendary shock power of their heavy cavalry could break the Ottoman line before superior numbers could tell. The decision was made for them by pressure from the nobility. Many Hungarian nobles refused to accept that they might be outmatched. They remembered victories against Ottoman forces in previous decades. They believed in the superiority of armoured knights over infantry. They pushed King Louis to attack immediately. On the morning of August 29, 1526, the two armies deployed on a marshy plain south of the village of Mohacs. The Hungarian position was chosen by their commanders, Archbishop Pál Tomori and other senior nobles. They occupied a small rise west of the Danube, their left flank protected by swamps and wetlands along the river, their right flank more exposed but defended by light cavalry screens. The Hungarian battle formation followed traditional European patterns. The first line consisted of heavy cavalry on both wings, with infantry and artillery in the centre. The right wing was commanded by Archbishop Tomori himself, an experienced warrior despite his clerical rank. The left wing was commanded by Ferenc Batiani, another prominent noble. In the centre, the Hungarian infantry formed up in tight formations, pikemen and arquebusiers mixing with the limited artillery. King Louis II positioned himself in the second line with approximately 3,000 heavy cavalry as a reserve, along with more light cavalry and a small infantry contingent. This reserve was meant to exploit success or shore up any part of the line that buckled. The problem with this formation was immediately apparent to experienced commanders. It was not structured in depth. The second line was too weak to follow up a successful charge effectively. The entire Hungarian battle plan depended on the first charge breaking the Ottoman line completely. Anything short of total success would likely mean disaster. The Hungarian artillery opened fire first in the early afternoon, bombarding the Ottoman positions as they continued to deploy. This was a mistake. The premature bombardment revealed the Hungarian positions and allowed the Ottomans to adjust their deployment accordingly. The Ottoman deployment was a masterpiece of defensive positioning. Sultan Suleiman had arranged his forces in three main defensive lines stretching across the plain. The first line, commanded by Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, consisted primarily of Rumelian cavalry drawn from Ottoman territories in Europe, approximately 4,000 Janissaries and a number of light cannon. These forces were positioned with excellent fields of fire, the artillery strings out with overlapping coverage. The second line, commanded by Behram Pasha, consisted of more Rumelian and Anatolian cavalry, along with additional infantry. The third line, commanded by Sultan Suleiman himself, was the key to the entire position. Here stood approximately 15,000 Janissaries, the elite core of the Ottoman infantry. They were formed in 8 to 9 consecutive rows, creating a formation that was both deep and flexible. The Janissaries were positioned behind the artillery, protected by the guns while being able to deliver supporting fire over and around them. On both flanks of the Janissary line stood the Sipahi elite cavalry, ready to counterattack once the Hungarian assault lost momentum. Additional forces were positioned in the rear and on the flanks. Light cavalry, the Akinci raiders, were positioned on raised, ground in the west, ready to launch the encircling manoeuvre that the Hungarians anticipated but could not prevent. More light cavalry and irregular troops called azabs provided screening forces and protected the Ottoman flanks. The entire deployment was designed with one purpose: to absorb the Hungarian cavalry charge, inflict maximum casualties through firepower, and then counterattack with fresh cavalry against disorganized and exhausted enemies. It was a defensive formation built around the killing power of massed muskets and artillery. The Janissaries were the anvil, the Sipahi cavalry would be the hammer. What happened next would become one of the most studied cavalry disasters in military history. Why Archbishop Tamori ordered the first charge is still debated by historians. Some suggest he saw an opportunity when he noticed the Ottoman Rumelian cavalry in the western sector were still setting up camp and not fully prepared. Others believe he was fooled by Ottoman-like cavalry manoeuvres that made the Turkish line look like it was breaking up. Whatever the reason, in the growing heat of the afternoon, Tamori led the Hungarian right-wing cavalry in a charge. Thousands of armoured knights, lances lowered, their horses accelerating into a gallop, thundered across the marshy plain toward the Ottoman lines. The sight must have been terrifying. Even experienced Ottoman soldiers watching this avalanche of steel and horseflesh bearing down would have felt fear. The ground shook, the air filled with the thunder of hooves and the shouts of Hungarian warriors. For a few minutes, it seemed the gamble would work. The Hungarian heavy cavalry smashed into the Ottoman first line with tremendous force. The Rumelian cavalry, lighter and less heavily armoured, were pushed back. Ottoman light cavalry scattered before the Hungarian onslaught. Tamori's men drove deep into the Ottoman positions, creating chaos and disorder among the irregulars and light cavalry units. Some Hungarian sources claim the cavalry penetrated so far that they nearly reached Sultan Suleiman's position. Ottoman sources confirm that arrows struck the Sultan's cuirass during the fighting, though he was not wounded. For a moment it appeared that the Hungarian charge had achieved the breakthrough that would win the battle. But this was exactly what Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha had planned. The Ottoman first line had conducted a fighting retreat, a feigned withdrawal that was actually a controlled tactical manoeuvre. As the Hungarian cavalry charged forward, becoming disordered in their pursuit of the fleeing Ottoman cavalry, the Turkish line pulled back to reveal what had been waiting behind them: the Janissaries and the artillery. The Hungarian cavalry suddenly found themselves confronted not with more light cavalry or exposed infantry, but with massed ranks of veteran infantry armed with muskets, standing behind rows of artillery pieces. The Turkish artillery opened fire. At close range, cannon firing solid shot or grape shot could tear through even armoured cavalry formations. Horses screamed and fell, knights were thrown from their saddles or crushed beneath their dying mounts. Then the Janissaries opened fire. The first rank, kneeling, delivered a volley that cut through the leading Hungarian knights. As those men reloaded, the second rank stepped forward and fired, then the third, then the fourth. The battlefield filled with gun smoke and the thunder of hundreds of muskets firing in coordinated volleys. The Hungarian cavalry, designed for the charge and the melee, had nothing to counter this wall of fire. They tried to close with the Janissaries, to get into sword range where their armour and training would give them the advantage, but the musket fire was too intense. Men and horses fell by the dozens. The Janissaries, protected by obstacles erected in front of their positions, maintaining their formation and discipline, continued their mechanical slaughter. Ottoman observers later described the Hungarian cavalry as being unable to penetrate the solid wall of Janissaries, no matter how many times they regrouped and charged. European sources confirmed this, describing how the Hungarian right wing, despite desperate bravery, could not break through the concentrated firepower. Archbishop Tamori, seeing his assault faltering, tried to rally his men for another charge, but the combination of artillery fire and massed musket volleys had broken the momentum of the attack. The Hungarian cavalry began to fragment. Some units tried to reform for another assault. Others, their horses dead or wounded, fought on foot in small desperate groups. Still others began to retreat back toward their starting positions. At this moment, King Louis II, watching from the second line, made a fatal decision. Believing that the battle could still be won if he committed his reserves, he ordered the second line to advance. Approximately 3,000 Hungarian heavy cavalry surged forward to support Tamori's battered units. The Hungarian infantry also advanced, moving at their slower pace toward the Ottoman centre. For a brief moment the Hungarians had nearly their entire force engaged and pressing forward. But this was the moment Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha had been waiting for. The Ottoman flanks, fresh cavalry that had not yet engaged, launched their counterattack. From both sides, Sipahi heavy cavalry and Akuncha light cavalry swept around and into the Hungarian formation. The encirclement that Hungarian commanders had feared was now happening. Meanwhile, the Janissaries and artillery continued their devastating fire. The Hungarian infantry, advancing into this maelstrom, found themselves unable to break through the obstacles protecting the Ottoman guns and infantry. They fought bravely. Contemporary accounts emphasize their courage, but they could not overcome the coordinated firepower of muskets and cannon. The Janissary volleys were precise and relentless. Unlike the limited ammunition of European arquebusiers, the Janissaries were backed by an extensive logistical system that kept them supplied. They could maintain their rate of fire for hours if necessary. The Hungarian left wing, commanded by Ferenc Batthyány, had initially held its position, but now found itself under assault from Ottoman cavalry that had broken through or bypassed the crumbling Hungarian centre. Though they resisted fiercely, the left wing eventually gave way. Once the Hungarian line broke, the battle became a slaughter. Ottoman cavalry poured through the gaps, attacking from multiple directions. The Hungarian cavalry, exhausted from their charges and disorganized by casualties, could not maintain formation. Individual units fought desperately, but there was no cohesive defense anymore. The infantry, trapped in the center and surrounded, were systematically destroyed. Those who tried to flee found the marshlands that had protected their flank now trapped them. Men in heavy armor, already exhausted from fighting, drowned in the swamps trying to escape. The Janissaries advanced, their discipline never breaking, methodically finishing off pockets of resistance with musket fire, and then close combat with their signature yataghan swords and axes. Contemporary Turkish sources described the battlefield as covered with bodies. Hungarian sources called it the greatest disaster since the Mongol invasion of 1241. Archbishop Tomori, who had led the initial charge with such confidence, died fighting. Contemporary Muslim chroniclers praised his courage. One wrote, "Covered with wounds like a mad dog, he recovered himself. When he rushed into the attack, impetuous as the Nile, he uttered screams like the trumpeting of elephants when tigers and lions flee before them. He fell somewhere on that blood-soaked field, his body never properly identified among the thousands of dead." King Louis II tried to escape as the battle collapsed into rout. Still in his armour, mounted on a warhorse, he fled with a small group of retainers toward the Danube. According to the most reliable accounts, his horse stumbled crossing a stream called the Seele. The young king, thrown from his saddle or trapped beneath his fallen horse, drowned in the shallow water. His body would not be found for weeks. Other accounts suggest he was simply crushed beneath his horse, unable to rise due to the weight of his armour. Either way, the 20-year-old monarch who had reigned for only 10 years died without ever drawing his sword in anger. With his death, the Jagiellonian dynasty in Hungary ended. The casualties were catastrophic. Approximately 14,000 Hungarian soldiers died, including 4,000 cavalry, 1/3 of their total mounted force. 7 bishops, 28 barons, and 500 lesser nobles perished. Nearly the entire leadership class of the kingdom died at Mohacs. In addition to those killed in battle, approximately 2,000 Hungarian prisoners were executed by the Ottomans after the fighting ended. Women and children captured during the campaign were sent to Constantinople as slaves. Ottoman casualties were significant, but nowhere near Hungarian losses. Estimates vary, but most modern historians believe the Ottomans lost between 1,500 and 2,000 men killed. The disparity in casualties reflects the one-sided nature of the battle, once the Janissaries began their methodical destruction of the Hungarian cavalry. Sultan Suleiman spent 3 days on the battlefield, reorganizing his army and ensuring his wounded were treated. Then he marched unopposed to Buda, the Hungarian capital, which he entered on September 10th. The city was plundered but not held. Suleiman withdrew his forces, taking over 100,000 captives with him back to Ottoman territory. The Ottomans did not initially occupy Hungary because Suleiman's goal had been to break Hungarian resistance, not to establish direct rule. That would come later. The immediate aftermath of Mohacs was political chaos. With King Louis dead and no clear heir, 2 rivals claimed the Hungarian throne. János Zápolyai, the Transylvanian magnate whose forces had not reached Mohacs in time, was elected king by one faction of nobles. Ferdinand of Habsburg, brother of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and brother-in-law of the dead King Louis, was elected by another faction. This dual election triggered a civil war that lasted from 1526 to 1538. The conflict weakened Hungary further, making it impossible to resist Ottoman expansion. By 1541, the Ottomans occupied the central and southern regions of Hungary, establishing a province ruled directly from Constantinople. The eastern portion, including Transylvania, became an autonomous principality under Ottoman protection. Only the western portion of the kingdom remained under Habsburg control. This tripartite division of Hungary would last nearly 150 years, until the Austrian Habsburgs finally expelled the Ottomans at the end of the 17th century. The Battle of Mohács had consequences far beyond Hungary. It established the Ottomans as the dominant military power in southeastern Europe. It brought the Ottoman Empire into direct confrontation with the Habsburg Empire, setting the stage for centuries of conflict. It demonstrated conclusively that heavy cavalry, the dominant military arm of European warfare for centuries, was vulnerable to well-disciplined infantry armed with firearms. The lessons were clear but took decades for European armies to fully absorb. Armour, no matter how thick, could not stop musket balls at close range. The charge, no matter how brave or powerful, could not overcome concentrated firepower delivered by disciplined formations. Individual knightly valour meant nothing against soldiers who fought as a coordinated unit with superior weapons and tactics. The Janissaries at Mohács had proven that the future of warfare belonged to professional infantry armed with gunpowder weapons and trained to fight in formation. Within decades, every major European army would be restructuring along similar lines, creating standing professional infantry units trained to fight with muskets in coordinated volleys. The age of the knight was ending. The age of the musketeer was beginning. It's worth examining why the Hungarian cavalry failed so completely. Many factors contributed, but the fundamental problem was tactical. The Hungarian battle plan relied on the decisive cavalry charge, a tactic that had worked for centuries against other cavalry or against poorly armed and trained infantry. But the Janissaries were neither poorly armed nor poorly trained. They were professionals who had spent years learning how to defeat exactly this kind of attack. The marshy terrain of the battlefield also favoured the defenders. Cavalry charges lose momentum and cohesion when crossing soft ground. Horses tire quickly, formations break apart. The Hungarians charged across ground that sapped their strength before they even reached the enemy. The Ottoman use of artillery positioned just in front of the Janissary lines created multiple layers of defence. The cavalry first had to survive artillery fire, then had to cross ground littered with obstacles, then had to face massed musket fire, all while maintaining enough cohesion to actually engage in melee combat. It was too much to ask of any cavalry force. The feigned retreat executed by the Ottoman first line was also masterful. It gave the Hungarians false hope, drawing them deeper into the killing zone. By the time the Hungarian cavalry realised they had been lured into a trap, they were committed and could not easily disengage. Once the encirclement began, with fresh Ottoman cavalry attacking from both flanks, the Hungarian position became untenable. The Hungarian infantry performed as well as could be expected under the circumstances. They advanced into a maelstrom of fire and fought until they were overwhelmed. But they were too few in number, inadequately supported by artillery, and faced an enemy that excelled at exactly this kind of defensive battle. Some historians have suggested that if the Hungarian cavalry had not charged, but instead had waited for the Ottomans to attack, the result might have been different. This is possible, but unlikely. The Ottomans had no reason to attack a prepared position. They could have simply bypassed the Hungarian army and marched on Buda, forcing King Louis to either abandon his capital or leave his defensive position to pursue. The reality is that the Hungarians were facing a larger, better equipped, and more tactically sophisticated army. The Ottomans had been fighting continuously for over a century. Their commanders had experience from campaigns across 3 continents. Their Janissaries had fought everyone from Persians to Mamluks to Venetians. The Hungarian army, by contrast, was internally divided, undertrained, and led by young and inexperienced commanders who still believed in tactics that were becoming obsolete. The gap in military quality was too large to overcome with bravery alone. The Janissaries who fought at Mohács were not invincible supermen. They were professional soldiers doing what they had been trained to do: form in disciplined ranks, maintain their positions under cavalry charges, fire in coordinated volleys, protect their artillery, fight in close combat when necessary. Simple tasks executed with exceptional discipline and training. Their success came from their institutional structure. The Devshirme system, for all its moral horrors, produced soldiers with unbreakable unit cohesion. These men had grown up together, trained together, fought together. They trusted each other completely. This unity made them far more effective than mercenary forces or feudal levies that might have better individual warriors but lacked the same group cohesion. The Janissaries also benefited from the Ottoman logistical system. They were well supplied with ammunition, food and equipment. Their weapons were standardized and maintained by dedicated support personnel. They had military hospitals to treat the wounded and move them behind the lines. They were, in every sense, a modern professional army in an age when most armies were still organised along feudal lines. The legacy of Mohacs haunted Hungary for centuries. The phrase, "more was lost at Mohacs," became a Hungarian saying meaning a catastrophic and irreversible loss. The battle entered Hungarian national mythology as a symbol of betrayal, bad leadership, and national tragedy. Blame was assigned to various parties, to King Louis for fighting when he should have waited, to János Szapolyai for not arriving in time, to the nobility for forcing the battle, to Western European powers for failing to send aid. The reality is more complex. Hungary in 1526 was already weakened by internal divisions, economic problems and military obsolescence. The Black Army of Matthias Corvinus, which might have provided a professional corps capable of matching the Janissaries, had been disbanded decades earlier due to cost. The nobility preferred to maintain their own private retinues rather than support a permanent national army. The peasant rebellion of 1514 had destroyed trust between the classes and made it impossible to raise effective infantry from the common people. And the rapid advance of military technology, particularly firearms, had made the traditional Hungarian reliance on heavy cavalry increasingly obsolete. Even if Hungary had won at Mohacs, it's unclear whether the kingdom could have resisted Ottoman expansion indefinitely. The Ottoman Empire at the height of its power under Suleiman the Magnificent was simply too strong for any single Central European power to resist alone. The battle also demonstrated the importance of combined arms warfare. The Ottomans won not because of any single advantage, but because they integrated infantry, cavalry, and artillery into a coherent system. The artillery weakened the Hungarian cavalry charge. The Janissaries stopped it completely. The Sipahi cavalry delivered the final counterattack. Each arm supported the others. The Hungarians, by contrast, treated their cavalry, infantry, and artillery as separate components that happened to be on the same battlefield. There was no real integration of capabilities. The cavalry charged without effective infantry support. The infantry advanced without adequate artillery support. The result was that each arm was defeated in detail by an enemy that used all three arms in coordination. This lesson about combined arms warfare would be relearned repeatedly over the following centuries. Waterloo, Gettysburg, the Somme, Kursk. Again and again, armies that failed to integrate their different capabilities effectively were defeated by enemies who did. The Ottomans in 1526 were simply ahead of their time in understanding this principle. For the Janissaries, Mohacs was their finest hour. They had faced the strongest cavalry force in Eastern Europe and destroyed it. Their discipline, training, and firepower had proven decisive. In the decades that followed, they would continue to dominate battlefields across the Ottoman Empire. They fought Persians, Austrians, Venetians, Poles, and Russians. They conquered territory from Algeria to Iraq, from the Ukraine to Yemen. But Mohacs was the moment when European armies finally understood that the age of the armoured knight was ending. Within a few decades, every major European power was creating their own versions of the Janissaries. Professional infantry units armed with muskets and trained to fight in formation. The Spanish tercios, the Swedish regiments of Gustavus Adolphus, the English New Model Army, all these famous formations owed a debt to the tactics proven at Mohacs. The Janissaries themselves would eventually decline. By the 17th century, the strict recruitment standards were abandoned. The sons of Janissaries and freeborn Muslims were allowed to join, diluting the elite nature of the corps. The prohibition on marriage was lifted. Janissaries began engaging in trade and politics, becoming more interested in their privileges than in military excellence. By the 18th century, they were resisting modernization and reform, seeing new military organizations as threats to their power and wealth. When Sultan Mahmud II finally disbanded the corps in 1826 in the so-called Auspicious Incident, executing or exiling thousands of Janissaries, the Ottoman military had already fallen far behind European armies, but that decline was still centuries away on that August day in 1526. On the field at Mohacs, the Janissaries stood as the finest infantry in the world, disciplined, professional, equipped with the latest weapons, trained to a degree that European armies could not match. When the Hungarian cavalry charged, the Janissaries did not break. They held their positions, they fired in coordinated volleys, they inflicted catastrophic casualties, and when the time came for close combat, they advanced with swords and axes and finished the job. The Hungarian nobles who had mocked the idea that infantry could defeat armoured knights learned their error too late. As their horses foundered in the marshy ground, as musket balls smashed through their armour, as they drowned in swamps or died beneath Ottoman swords, they discovered that warfare had changed. That discipline beat individual heroism, that firepower beat armour, that professional soldiers beat feudal levies. King Louis II died at Mohacs without ever truly understanding what had happened. Hungary died with him, not to re-emerge as an independent kingdom for over 4 centuries. The Janissaries marched away from that blood-soaked field and continued their campaigns of conquest, and European military commanders studied the battle and began the long process of transforming their own armies to meet this new reality. The day Ottoman Janissaries broke Europe's strongest cavalry was the day European warfare entered the modern age, the age of gunpowder and professional armies, the age where tactics and training mattered more than noble birth, the age where a well-disciplined infantryman with a musket was worth a dozen armoured knights. Mohacs was not just a battle. It was a revolution written in blood on Hungarian soil. The revolution continued to ripple across Europe for decades after Mohacs. But to truly understand the magnitude of what happened on that Hungarian field, we need to examine the technical details of how Janissary musket fire actually worked and why it was so devastatingly effective against armoured cavalry. The matchlock musket, the primary weapon of the Janissaries at Mohacs, was a relatively simple device but required extensive training to use effectively in combat. The weapon consisted of a smoothbore iron or bronze barrel, typically about 120 centimetres long, mounted on a wooden stock. The firing mechanism used a serpentine, an S-shaped lever that held a piece of slow-burning match cord. When the trigger was pulled, the serpentine lowered the burning match into a pan filled with priming powder. This ignited the main powder charge in the barrel, propelling a lead ball toward the target. The process of loading and firing was complex and required over 20 distinct steps to execute properly. The soldier had to measure the correct amount of powder from his powder horn or cartridge, pour it down the barrel, take a lead ball from his ammunition pouch, wrap it in a small patch of cloth or paper to ensure a tight fit, ram it down the barrel with a wooden ramrod, draw the ramrod back out and return it to its holder beneath the barrel, open the priming pan on the side of the weapon, fill it with finer grained priming powder, close the pan cover, blow on the match cord to ensure it was burning properly, position the match in the serpentine, bring the weapon to his shoulder, aim, pull the trigger. In the hands of a novice, this process could take 2 minutes or more. A trained European arquebusier might manage to fire twice per minute under ideal conditions, but the Janissaries, through years of constant drilling, could maintain a rate of fire of 3 rounds per minute, and some sources suggest the best could achieve 4 rounds per minute. This doesn't sound impressive by modern standards, but in the context of 16th century warfare it was revolutionary. The key to Janissary effectiveness was not individual rate of fire, but the coordination of volleys across multiple ranks. The 8 or 9 rank formation meant that while the front rank was reloading, 7 or 8 other ranks were either firing or preparing to fire. This created a rhythm of destruction, a continuous rolling thunder of musket fire that never paused long enough for charging cavalry to close the distance. The actual killing power of these muskets is worth examining in detail. A 50 caliber lead ball, weighing approximately 28 grams, fired from a matchlock musket had a muzzle velocity of around 400 to 500 meters per second. At close range, within 50 meters, this projectile could penetrate even the best plate armor of the period. Contemporary armor testing, both period accounts and modern recreations, confirm that 16th century plate armor could be penetrated by musket fire at ranges under 100 meters. At 200 meters, penetration became less reliable, depending on the angle of impact and the thickness of the armour. But even when the ball didn't penetrate, the impact could cause severe blunt force trauma. A lead ball striking a breastplate might not punch through, but it could dent the armour inward, breaking ribs or causing internal injuries. Impacts to the helmet could cause concussions or neck injuries even without penetration, and horses, lacking any armour in most cases or protected only by light barding on their chest and face, were extremely vulnerable. A single hit could bring down a warhorse, and a fallen horse meant a dismounted knight, vulnerable and often unable to rise quickly due to the weight of his armour. The Janissaries at Mohatch also employed psychological warfare through their firing discipline. European observers who witnessed Janissary volleys described the effect as more terrifying than the actual casualties inflicted. The sound of hundreds of muskets firing simultaneously was unlike anything most soldiers had experienced. The roar, the smoke, the sight of dozens of men and horses falling all combined to create panic. The continuous nature of the fire was particularly demoralizing. Against a single volley, cavalry might steel themselves and continue the charge. But against volley after volley with no apparent pause, the bravest men began to waver. Contemporary accounts from various battles involving Janissaries describe cavalry charges simply stopping, the horses refusing to advance further into the fire, or the riders losing their nerve. At Mohatch, this psychological effect combined with actual casualties to shatter the Hungarian cavalry's cohesion. The front ranks, those who survived the first volleys, found themselves isolated as ranks behind them faltered or veered away. Without the mass and momentum of a unified charge, even those knights who reached the Janissary lines were too few to break through. The Janissaries also benefited from careful defensive preparations. Ottoman armies typically carried prefabricated obstacles, essentially wooden stakes and frames that could be quickly assembled and positioned in front of infantry formations. These obstacles, similar to the chevaux de frise used in later periods, were designed specifically to break up cavalry charges. A horse confronted with a barrier of sharpened stakes would naturally slow or stop, giving Janissary muskets additional time to inflict casualties. At Mohatch, these obstacles were positioned in depth. The first line of obstacles forced the Hungarian cavalry to slow and manoeuvre, exposing them to artillery fire. The second line, positioned just in front of the main Janissary formation, forced them to slow again, right at the optimal range for musket fire. Even if Hungarian knights broke through the obstacles, they did so in small groups rather than in a unified mass. This allowed the Janissaries to concentrate their fire on manageable numbers of enemies. Fighting in small groups, the Hungarians lost the primary advantage of the cavalry charge, which was overwhelming momentum and mass. The training regimen that produced these disciplined Janissaries was brutal and comprehensive. Boys recruited through the Devshirm system began their military education in their early teens or even younger. They started as a semi-Olana, apprentice youths, assigned to experienced Janissaries who taught them the basics. These boys learned to march in formation, a skill that seems simple but requires constant practice to maintain alignment and spacing while moving across uneven ground. They learned to obey orders instantly and without question. They learned to load and fire muskets until they could do it in their sleep. They practiced volleying, firing on command, timing their shots to coordinate with dozens or hundreds of other men. As they progressed in training, they learned close combat with the yataghan sword, a distinctive curved blade with a forward-angled grip, and various axes and maces. They studied tactics and strategy. They learned to read terrain and understand how to use ground to their advantage. The entire process took years, and only those who proved themselves capable were elevated to full Janissary status. Those who couldn't meet the standards were assigned to auxiliary units or administrative positions. This level of training created a psychological resilience that European feudal levies could not match. Janissaries at Mohatch did not break and run when the Hungarian cavalry thundered toward them because they had trained for exactly this scenario hundreds of times. They knew their formations would hold. They trusted their officers. They believed in their tactics. Most importantly, they trusted the men beside them. This unit cohesion, forged through years of living, training and fighting together, was the true secret weapon of the Janissary Corps, a feudal levy of Hungarian peasants forced to serve a nobility they resented. Fighting alongside strangers from different villages and regions could never achieve this level of solidarity. Even the Hungarian nobility, for all their personal courage and military skill, fought as individuals or small retinue groups rather than as a unified force. This lack of cohesion made them vulnerable to an enemy that fought as a disciplined collective. The aftermath of Mohacs saw a fundamental reassessment of military doctrine across Europe. Reports of the battle, carried by survivors and by Venetian and Habsburg diplomats who gathered information from both sides, spread quickly. Military theorists began publishing treatises on the proper use of firearms in infantry formations. The writings of Niccolò Machiavelli, who had advocated for professional militias and the importance of infantry, gained new currency. The Spanish military, already developing the tercio formation that would dominate European battlefields for the next century, studied Mohacs intensely. The tercio combined pikemen and arquebusiers in a single formation, with the pikes protecting the shooters from cavalry charges, while the firearms provided offensive firepower. This was essentially the same combined arms approach the Janissaries had perfected, adapted to European conditions and organizations. By the 1530s, Spanish tercios were demonstrating on Italian battlefields that well-trained infantry with firearms could dominate both cavalry and traditional pike formations. The French, traumatized by defeats to Spanish and imperial forces, also began reforming their military. Francis I created permanent infantry regiments with standardized equipment and training. These legions were explicitly modelled on what French observers had learned about Ottoman military organisation. The French recognized that the individual bravery of their nobility was insufficient against professional infantry. The German states, always at the forefront of military innovation, developed the Landsknecht formations and later imperial infantry regiments that emphasized firearms and formation discipline. The Swedes, under Gustavus Adolphus nearly a century later, would perfect the volley fire system that the Janissaries had pioneered, creating an army that could deliver coordinated firepower with a precision that surpassed even Ottoman standards. But military reform was slow and met with resistance from the nobility across Europe. Knights and nobles had built their entire social position on their role as the military elite. The idea that peasants, armed with muskets, could defeat armoured cavalry threatened not just military doctrine but the entire social order. Many nobles refused to accept the lessons of Mohacs. They argued that the Hungarian defeat was due to poor leadership, bad terrain, or numerical inferiority, not to any fundamental superiority of infantry over cavalry. They pointed out that cavalry remained essential for reconnaissance, pursuit, and exploitation of breakthroughs. They noted, correctly, that infantry without cavalry support was vulnerable to flanking attacks and encirclement. These arguments had merit. Cavalry was not obsolete, it was simply no longer the dominant arm. But accepting this required nobles to accept that their special status was diminishing, that the military skills they had spent lifetimes perfecting were becoming less valuable, that common soldiers armed with weapons requiring weeks rather than years to master could kill nobles with centuries of martial tradition. This psychological and social resistance to change meant that many European armies continued to overemphasize cavalry long after Mohacs had demonstrated the risks. The Ottomans themselves continued to refine their military system after Mohacs. Sultan Suleiman used the victory to project power throughout southeastern Europe. In 1529 he besieged Vienna, the Habsburg capital, though the city's strong fortifications and determined defence prevented its capture. The failure at Vienna demonstrated that while Janissaries excelled in open battle, siege warfare was more complex. The Ottomans withdrew but maintained their hold on most of Hungary. Throughout the 1530s and 1540s, Ottoman armies campaigned in Hungary, Moldavia, and against the Habsburgs. The Janissaries were at the centre of every major victory. At the siege of Esztergom in 1543, Janissaries stormed the city's fortifications after a devastating artillery bombardment. At the Battle of Wagram in 1527, Janissary firepower again shattered a Hungarian cavalry force. The pattern established at Mohacs repeated itself in battle after battle. European cavalry would charge, Ottoman artillery and Janissary muskets would inflict terrible casualties, Ottoman cavalry would counterattack, the European formation would collapse, yet the Janissaries faced challenges that would eventually undermine their effectiveness. The Devshirme system, the source of their quality, became controversial within the Ottoman Empire. Many Muslims objected to the practice of forcibly converting Christian children and elevating them to positions of power within the state. Some argued that freeborn Muslims should be allowed to join the Janissary corps. Sultan Murad III in the late 16th century began allowing the sons of Janissaries to join the corps. This seems like a minor change, but it fundamentally altered the nature of the organisation. The sons of Janissaries had not gone through the rigorous selection and training process. They joined because of family, connections, not merit. They often lacked the discipline and commitment of their fathers. As more and more Janissaries were recruited from within the corps rather than through Devshirme, standards declined. By the early 17th century, Janissaries were openly marrying, engaging in trade, and involving themselves in Istanbul politics. They began to see themselves as a privileged class rather than as soldiers. Their primary loyalty shifted from the Sultan to their own corporate interests. When sultans tried to reform the military or reduce Janissary privileges, the corps revolted. Between 1600 and 1826, Janissaries deposed or forced the abdication of numerous sultans, who tried to curtail their power. The military effectiveness declined accordingly. Janissaries in the 17th and 18th centuries were no longer the disciplined professional force that had fought at Mohacs. Training standards dropped, equipment maintenance suffered, discipline eroded. European armies, meanwhile, had caught up and even surpassed Ottoman standards. The military revolution that swept Europe in the 17th century, driven by the 30 Years' War and conflicts between major powers, produced armies with firepower and discipline that matched or exceeded Janissary capabilities. When Austria, Russia, and other powers went on the offensive against the Ottomans in the late 17th century, they discovered that Ottoman forces were no longer invincible. The Great Turkish War of 1683 to 1699 saw the Ottomans suffer a series of devastating defeats. The siege of Vienna in 1683 failed disastrously, with Ottoman forces routed by a combined Habsburg and Polish relief army. The Janissaries, once feared for their steadiness under fire, broke and fled. At the Battle of Zenta in 1697, Austrian forces under Prince Eugene of Savoy destroyed an Ottoman army attempting to cross a river, killing over 20,000 Ottomans, including many Janissaries. These defeats revealed that the military balance had shifted decisively in Europe's favour. The reasons for this shift were multiple. European armies had adopted and improved upon Ottoman innovations. They had created their own professional standing armies with year-round training. They had developed more effective artillery and better firearms. The flintlock musket, replacing the matchlock, was more reliable and faster to fire. European military engineering, driven by competition between many different powers, advanced rapidly. Logistics improved. The widespread use of linear formations and sophisticated drill manuals allowed European armies to deliver firepower more efficiently than Ottoman forces. But perhaps most importantly, European states had developed the administrative and financial systems to support permanent professional militaries. The fiscal military state, pioneered by the Dutch and later perfected by the French and British, could mobilise resources on a scale the Ottoman Empire struggled to match. By the 18th century, European armies were larger, better equipped, and more professionally trained than Ottoman forces. The Janissary Corps itself became a barrier to reform. When Sultan Selim III tried to create a new modern army in the late 18th century, the Janissaries saw it as a threat and revolted. Selim was deposed and later murdered. His successor, Mahmud II, proceeded more cautiously but with the same goal. He quietly built up new military units trained in European methods while avoiding direct confrontation with the Janissaries. By 1826, Mahmud felt strong enough to act. When Janissaries rioted in Istanbul to protest military reforms, Mahmud declared them to be rebels against the state. His new artillery units, positioned around Janissary barracks, opened fire with grape shot. Thousands of Janissaries were killed in the bombardment. Others were hunted down in the following days. Survivors were exiled or forcibly disbanded. The Janissary Corps, which had existed for over 4 centuries, was destroyed in a matter of days. This event, called the Auspicious Incident by Ottoman authorities, was celebrated as necessary modernisation. But it also marked the end of an era. The organisation that had broken Hungarian cavalry at Mohacs, that had been the cutting edge of military innovation for centuries, was gone. Looking back at Mohacs from this longer perspective, we can see it as both a beginning and a peak. It was the moment when the military revolution centred on firearms and professional infantry became undeniable. Every European power had to confront the fact that traditional cavalry-dominated armies were obsolete. The lessons learned at Mohacs drove military reforms across the continent. But Mohacs was also the peak of Janissary effectiveness. Never again would they achieve such a one-sided victory against a major European power. The Hungarian cavalry they destroyed represented the last great cavalry force still fighting in traditional medieval style. Later European armies would be more balanced, with infantry, cavalry and artillery working together in more sophisticated ways. The Janissaries themselves would never again be as well-trained, disciplined and motivated as they were in 1526. The human cost of Mohacs echoed through Hungarian history for centuries. The kingdom never recovered its independence. The trauma of the defeat shaped Hungarian national identity, creating a sense of historical victimization and missed opportunity. Hungarian historians and poets return to Mohacs again and again, asking what might have been if different choices had been made. If Szapolyai had arrived with his Transylvanian troops, if King Louis had waited for reinforcements, if the nobility had agreed to maintain a professional standing army like the Black Army, if Hungary had adopted firearms and modern tactics sooner. These counterfactuals are ultimately unanswerable, but they reflect the magnitude of the disaster. In 2 hours of combat, Hungary lost its independence, its military elite, its king, and its future as a major power. For the soldiers who fought at Mohacs, on both sides, the battle was an experience that shaped the rest of their lives. Ottoman veterans spoke of it with pride, as the moment when they broke the strongest Christian cavalry in the East. Hungarian survivors, the relatively few who escaped the field and the subsequent rout, carried the trauma of that defeat for the rest of their lives. Some went into exile, serving foreign courts and forever bitter about what had been lost. Others remained in Hungary and navigated the complex politics of a divided kingdom, trying to preserve what they could of Hungarian autonomy under Ottoman or Habsburg rule. A few turned to literature and history, recording their memories of the battle so that future generations would understand what had happened and why. The weapons used at Mohacs continued to evolve rapidly after the battle. Matchlock muskets gradually gave way to wheel-lock mechanisms and then to flintlocks. Each generation of firearms became more reliable, faster to fire and more accurate. By the late 17th century, the muskets used by European and Ottoman armies were vastly superior to those used at Mohacs. Bayonets, which could turn a musket into a pike, eliminated the need for separate formations of pikemen. This increased the firepower that infantry formations could deliver, as every soldier could now carry a firearm rather than a close combat weapon. Artillery also improved dramatically. Standardized calibers, better casting techniques, and improved gunpowder made 17th and 18th century cannons far more effective than their 16th century predecessors. The weight of metal that armies could throw at each other increased exponentially. Battles became more lethal and more decisive. The relatively small casualties at Mohacs, horrific by contemporary standards, would seem almost mild compared to the slaughter of later centuries. But in 1526, Mohacs represented the state of the art in military technology and tactics. The Janissaries, who stood in their ranks, muskets ready, were the most advanced military force in the world. The tactics they employed, volley fire from deep formations supported by artillery and protected by obstacles, represented the cutting edge of military thought. The Hungarian cavalry who charged them were brave and skilled, but they were fighting with tactics that were already obsolete. The outcome was never really in doubt once the Hungarians committed to the attack. The mathematics of firepower, the discipline of professional soldiers, the coordination of combined arms warfare, all favoured the Ottomans. Mohacs was not a miracle or a fluke. It was the inevitable result when a modern professional army met a feudal force still fighting in the old way. The legacy of Mohacs extends beyond military history into the realm of cultural memory and national identity. For Hungarians, August 29th is remembered as a day of national tragedy, comparable to the Holocaust or the Soviet suppression of the 1956 uprising in terms of historical trauma. The phrase "more was lost at Mohacs" entered the Hungarian language as a way of describing catastrophic and irreversible loss. The battlefield itself became a site of pilgrimage and remembrance. Monuments erected in later centuries commemorate the fallen Hungarian nobles and the young king who drowned trying to escape. For Turks, Mohacs is remembered as one of the great victories of the Ottoman classical age, a moment when Sultan Suleiman's forces demonstrated Ottoman military supremacy. Turkish historians place it alongside the conquest of Constantinople and the Battle of Chaldiran as defining moments of Ottoman power. Modern historians debate various aspects of the battle. Some question whether the casualties were as one-sided as Ottoman sources claim. They note that victors often exaggerate enemy losses while minimizing their own. Some argue that Hungarian sources, written by survivors who had political reasons to emphasize the disaster, may have inflated the casualty figures. More balanced estimates suggest that while the Hungarian defeat was severe, the actual numbers killed might have been lower than the traditional figures. However, even the most conservative estimates confirm that Mohács was a catastrophic defeat that cost Hungary the majority of its military leadership and made continued resistance impossible. Others debate the tactical decisions made by both sides. Could the Hungarians have employed different tactics that might have succeeded? Should they have avoided battle entirely? Was the Ottoman deployment really as sophisticated as sources describe, or did they simply benefit from superior numbers and firepower? These debates will likely continue as long as military historians study the battle. What is not in question is the impact Mohács had on the development of European warfare. Every major military power studied the battle and drew conclusions that influenced their military reforms. The dominance of firepower over armour, the importance of professional training and discipline, the effectiveness of combined arms tactics, all these lessons that Mohács taught were absorbed and implemented across Europe. The military revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, which transformed European armies from feudal levies into professional standing forces, was accelerated by Mohács. The battle served as proof that the old ways were no longer viable, that armies needed to adapt or face destruction. The Hungarian cavalry had been among the finest in Europe, yet they had been slaughtered in hours by disciplined infantry with firearms. If this could happen to Hungary, it could happen to any European power that failed to modernize. In the end, the Battle of Mohács was about more than tactics and technology. It was about the clash between two different ways of organizing society for war. The Hungarian system was based on feudal obligations, noble retinues, and the individual martial prowess of the aristocracy. It was a system that had worked for centuries but was becoming obsolete in the face of new military realities. The Ottoman system was based on centralized state power. Professional soldiers recruited and trained specifically for military service, and the systematic application of the latest military technology. It was a preview of the modern nation-state's approach to warfare. At Mohács, the modern system destroyed the medieval one. The age of the knight gave way to the age of the musketeer. The dominance of cavalry gave way to the dominance of infantry. Individual heroism gave way to collective discipline, and the Janissaries, standing in their ranks with their matchlock muskets smoking, proved that the future of warfare belonged to professional infantry armed with firearms. The thunder of their volleys echoed across Europe, announcing that a new age had begun, an age that would culminate centuries later in the trenches of the Somme and the beaches of Normandy, where infantry armed with firearms would dominate the battlefield in ways the Janissaries of 1526 could never have imagined. But it all began on that marshy field in southern Hungary, where 15,000 professional soldiers showed Europe's finest cavalry that the rules had changed, and nothing would ever be the same.